Hi everyone, welcome to another video. So the convoy circus is not over yet. You might have heard that there's a bikers, not a convoy, heading to Ottawa this weekend. And we're not going to say it's a convoy because according to the lead organizer, Neil from the Hill, it is not a convoy. So everything was going well with Neil, who was working with the police to organize this bikers, whatever it is. And then just recently, just now, barely a couple of days ago, the police turns around and says that the bikes can't be in certain areas of Ottawa, and the police issued this general public notice saying that since the time of the unlawful protest, the City of Ottawa and the police service have maintained a posture that no vehicle-based or supported protests, rallies, or events will be allowed in the downtown core. And then they go on to say this is in line with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Protests and demonstrations and rallies, etc., will continue to be allowed, but vehicles are excluded from participating in these events. So I want to bring up where this idea comes from, and I think it's important. A little while back, Karim Assad was with a few other people on an important episode of The Agenda on Steve Bacon's show. And they were discussing the convoy and the legal aspects and the policing aspects of what happened in that winter protest. Now, Karima is a lawyer with an interesting range of specializations and activities, and she was part of the Agenda episode because throughout the whole protest and convoy, she was documenting pretty closely a lot of the things that were happening. And her tweets and her coverage in its different formats got a lot of attention from the mainstream media. And what came up is that the Charter of Rights doesn't cover vehicles. It covers people, it protects people, it enables people to protest as they please or, within the framework of the Charter, but it doesn't cover vehicles. So I want to play a few moments from that important episode where these ideas are sort of captured.
It changed, in my view, the relationship between the police and the demonstrators and the city. And I know that as a board, one of the questions I asked is, and one of the things I never understood is why were trucks allowed to re-enter the city after they had left the demonstration? And then we saw trucks that were re-entering. And that made no sense to me. And we asked, why are these trucks being allowed to re-enter? And the answer we were given was that the protesters had a charter right to bring their vehicles downtown. That made no sense to me. As a board, we don't have the ability to challenge it.
We've got a lawyer here, and I want to pursue that idea of they had a charter right to protest, to assemble, to have those trucks in the shadow of Parliament Hill. Okay, Karima, you're a lawyer. Does that make sense to you?
That does not make sense to me. There is, of course, charter rights that protect political expression, the right to assembly, so on and so forth. But there's nothing specifically that allows for the use of commercial vehicles as a tool of protest, especially where there is ample evidence that these vehicles were detrimental, whether it was through the honking, through the idling and the noise pollution act. But I don't see that using a truck is something that the Charter protects.
No, I appreciate that there are limits on all of our fundamental freedoms in this country. Having said that, it's right there in black and white in the Charter. We do have the freedom to assemble. And that's what they were doing. They were assembling. Now, obviously, they had trucks, they had horns, et cetera, et cetera. Could they reasonably conclude that they were in compliance with the Charter?
I believe that many thought that they were in compliance with the Charter, and the way that it was enforced gave them reason to think that. But the logistics of this type of operation, preventing the actual trucks, does not mean that you're preventing an individual from protesting. And so the truck and the person are not inseparable.
Now, looking at one of her more recent tweets, she mentions Liz Moore from the Anti-Hate Network. And what's interesting is that Liz Moore used to be supposedly some kind of white supremacist. Now, this is interesting because the whole convoy was used to highlight a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric. And in fact, so much so that you'd think it was the whole point of the convoy. And I made this point in one of my earlier videos. What's also interesting is that Tamara Lich's lawyer is Lawrence Greenspan. So Tamara Lich is the leading convoy organizer who set up the GoFundMe campaign that gathered $10 million and more. And she has now been charged with mischief and other charges. She initially hired Diane Magas, I think that's how you say it. And now she's got Lawrence Greenspan on board to represent her. Now, this guy is a high-profile lawyer with big cases under his belt. And he sounds pretty expensive, and I wonder where she's getting the money to hire him and pay for him. So let's look at this high-profile lawyer a little bit and what he's about. Lawrence Greenspan is currently a partner in the Ottawa firm Greenspan, Granger and Hill, certified specialist in both criminal and civil litigation, criminal defense and civil litigation. Number of high-profile cases. Again, sounds expensive. And he sued the Senate and the RCMP for $8 million in lost income. He is heavily involved in fundraising campaigns for the Jewish National Fund of Ottawa, and he's involved in Reach Canada and is on several boards. So let's look up the Jewish National Fund of Ottawa, and I get this organization, Soloway. So it sounds like it's under a different name. When I ran the search, it turned out to be, this is what came up for the Ottawa Jewish Community Center. So Soloway GCC is, like you might expect, one of those organizations that I'm all too familiar with. And of course, in the programs, you get the usual sponsorships here. And it is really interesting because this entire convoy has been used as some kind of place where there was a lot of white supremacy and anti-Semitic narrative that was enabled. And the Anti-Hate Network of Canada highlighted these issues. But what's interesting is the obvious both sides being played by the same people narrative that is happening all over again with the convoy. They are being played into this like it's the easiest thing in the world. And something that jumped out to me is how closely the media and, of course, the government are watching this. The mainstream media seems to be keeping a pretty close eye at the people involved with this. They say here, this is a CBC article, the event's website lists 3 partners that include a veterans group wanting to restore and protect fundamental rights, a second group that says it wants to end all tyrannical laws, and a pro-convoy streamer whose videos go back to the last days of the Ottawa occupation. That was back in winter, the big convoy. Now, this sort of jumped out to me a little bit as worrisome because this streamer is this guy here. His name is Dave, and he has this channel called Live from the Shed. And the issue to me is that it looks like a pretty small channel, but I guess since he's supporting in one way or another the bikers Not-A-Convoy, that probably jumped out to the media. In this video, he's interviewing this woman called Melissa McKee. She and her husband run the capital city Ottawa's biker church. And the biker church is listed as, taking part in the events for the Rolling Thunder event, or Not-A-Convoy, whatever you want to call it. In this interview, she is like weeping all throughout for her love for the truckers. Initially, she and her husband were at odds about whether they would open their doors to the truckers when the big convoy happened because they were supposedly not political, and as a church, they were neutral. But then she felt it would have been the right thing to do to open their doors to the truckers, and she was weeping because, in her words, like a 1950s housewife, she had to submit to her husband. And later on, it dawned on him, and it seems like God played his hand in this, and they opened their church to the truckers. So they've been involved in this ever since. And a little later on in the in the interview here with Dave, she says that she doesn't really consider herself a biker, but she rides on the back of the bike. So all throughout, she's like weeping, and she's one of those silly goody two shoes, so loving Christian women. That all of that phony stuff. Of course, they're not weeping so much for the Zionism that the sponsor across the pond on the other side of the world. And so what this silly interview produced is City News coming with this ridiculous piece of media celebrating women's motorcycle culture. And this came like so soon after. And, it's just so silly how they push these narratives as though imitating men is what's going to create progress when nothing can be further from the truth. So this whole thing is just one big mess across every side. The bikers are completely clueless about who is sponsoring this. They have no clue about what Tamara Lich's lawyer is about. And it is just a mess across the board. It is so cringy. Oh, of course. It's so cringy. No one is getting it. This is just absolutely a ridiculous state of affairs, and it is a fail. This is not going to be helped. And while all of this biker frivolity is underway, the folks in big government and the mainstream media are actually now questioning whether it might be time to make changes to the charter. And yes, of course, the convoy was part of this. Congratulations.
Give all of us an identity rooted in the Constitution that no government can destroy.
In those 40 years, Canadians have used the Charter to challenge legislation, and the Supreme Court has ruled on everything from abortion rights to religious freedoms to hate speech. Human rights advocates in a virtual presentation said the Charter remains a work in progress.
The Charter of Rights and Freedoms is a strong promise, but it's an unfulfilled promise.
Indigenous Canadians and racialized communities were given little consideration 40 years ago.
There were groups of Canadians today who did not have a voice when these were put together. I believe the time has come to reevaluate the Charter of Rights.
Today, charter rights are still being debated. The rights of the Freedom Convoy to assemble in Ottawa became an angry confrontation, ended by the government's emergency measures, a recognition that rights under the Charter can be limited. And the rights of many Quebecers to wear religious symbols have been blocked by the province's secularism law. That's expected to be challenged before the Supreme Court.
The existence of the Charter is no guarantee that the rights of Canadians are protected. That to keep these rights, we need to stand up in defense of them anytime they are.